Now, you spent some time studying ayahuasca.
Yes.
And that's kind of an interesting story. So maybe you could tell everybody who's watching and listening how ayahuasca is prepared, and also how unlikely it was that that preparation method was discovered. And I'd like to know if you have any more insight into how in the world that ever came about.
Yes to both. I did my PhD research at the University of British Columbia. Was basically about ayahuasca, about looking at the chemistry, pharmacology, botanical sources, traditional uses of ayahuasca. Another aspect of my thesis research was kind of a comparison of ayahuasca with another much more obscure Amazonian psychedelic called ukuhe, which comes from entirely different botanical sources. But like ayahuasca, it is also an orally active form of dimethyltryptamine, and that's the key to this. DMT is a short-acting psychedelic, but it's not orally active by itself. If you consume DMT, if you drink a tea that contains DMT, or just eat DMT or whatever, it's not active because there are enzymes in the gut, monoamine oxidases, that will inactivate DMT before it's ever absorbed in the active form. What indigenous people have done when they prepare ayahuasca, they combine it with another plant that contains monoamine oxidase inhibitors, this class of compounds called beta-carbolines, very potent, very selective MAO inhibitors. So if you make a beverage, a drink, or decoction is really the technical term, with a plant that contains DMT and a plant that contains these beta-carbolines, then it becomes orally active. And instead of a 10 to 20 minute experience, which is what you get when you smoke DMT or vape DMT, they do that now these days, or inject it even, you get about 20 to 30 minutes of an experience, but in the oral form, it stretches it out to 6 or 7 hours. So it's a very different experience. It's not as intense, but in some way it's deeper, it's more profound, because the thing with taking DMT by a parenteral route, other than through the gut, it is profound, it's very intense, it's also so fast that by the time you're just beginning to sort of get to the place, it's already fading. So you come back with not a lot of information, a kind of a sense of astonishment, but not a lot of hard data. So the idea of ayahuasca is you get to spend more time in that place, in that altered state, and there's a chance to learn more. Now, how did this come about? The question always comes up. How did these indigenous people figure out this combination? One plant containing beta-carbolines and another containing DMT. Out of the 80,000 or so species in the Amazon, how did they stumble on this one combination? Was it trial and error, or how? If you talk to the people, they will say, well, the plants told us, but to a Western scientist, this doesn't make a lot of sense. The plants told you? What are you talking about? Actually, I think the real story is a little more prosaic, in a sense that in our ESPD 50 conference, we had an anthropologist, Dr. Manolo Torres, who presented on this. And the fact is that at a certain point, maybe 1,000 years ago, possibly a little earlier than that, there was a very active there were different cultures that were living sort of in proximity to each other in the region where Colombia, Venezuela, and Peru now come together. These cultures were very experimentally oriented toward plants. They had shamanic traditions, and they were also very active in making chicha. They were essentially beer producers. They distilled, or they didn't distill them, but they had different fermented beverages prepared from fruits and grains and things like that. And they had many different kinds of chicha, mostly prepared from manioc. And they were also experimentalists. They were like craft brewers today, sort of. Craft brewers they have their beer, but then they'll just reach for anything on the shelf, or an ingredient will come up and they'll say, "Oh, let's make a craft brew with kava in it, or with some other plant. Let's make something interesting." Well, the people making the chicha had the same sort of curiosity. And in their medicinal pharmacopoeia, they had the snuffs, right? That's the other way in the Amazon that the DMT is used, in the form of snuff. And they had these snuffs. They had these antidanthera snuffs, which don't require MAO inhibitors because you take them, as a snuff. They also had Banisteriopsis, which is the vine that contains the beta-carbonates. They use that separately as a medicinal plant for various reasons, and it has some psychoactivity. Basically, I think they stumbled on this formulation. The plants were in the mix, as it were, and they stumbled on this formulation, but it wasn't entirely trial and error. It was more like an educated guess, not really from the standpoint of biochemistry. They didn't think in terms of monoamine oxidase inhibition and that sort of thing, but they were familiar with the effects of these different plants, and they thought, well, what happens if we mix them? And they did. They had a spectacular result.
I was talking to Brian Murarescu, I think it's probably
Yes.
more than a year ago. He wrote The Immortality Key, and he was, although a lawyer, the book is about ethnopharmacology in many regards, and it sounds to me like the account that you're making of what happened in the Amazon jungle sounds to me very much like what seemed to happen in ancient Greek culture with their formulation of various psychedelic wines.
That's right.
And so all these different people were just brewing all these different concoctions and experimenting to see what produced the most remarkable effect. And in Greece, they seem to have stumbled across something that was perhaps LSD-based, or essentially LSD-based, whereas in the Amazon jungle, they came across both DMT and the chemical that inhibited its breakdown. And so it's very interesting to see that is likely the case in both those disparate cultures.